So, we are back. Uh, Having looked at the mechanical side of this history of AI, we want to now look at the philosophical side as to this notion of the mind. What is the notion of the mind? How did this notion of the mind ever come out, and how can we get it across to the machines essentially? So, the medieval view, world view in Europe was basically a Christian adaptation of Greek ideas essentially. There was a big gap between the Greeks and medieval Europe, but these ideas that we Greeks started off with eventually ended up in medieval Europe, and the view of the world was of course that it was a very anthropocentric view of the world, that humans were at the center of the universe and everything revolved around the earth essentially. So, we look at some of those ideas, and so what we are trying to see is how did human beings as sentient beings come up with the notion of the mind. How would you even imagine that there is something called a mind? I mean, of course, you are there in the world, you are immersed in the world and you are interacting with the world, but how do you come to this conclusion that you have thoughts and ideas which are in some sense existing independently? So, we start with the Platonic view of the world, the idea of which came from Plato. He said that in the perfect world there are these creators ideas, the God's ideas, and our ideas, the human ideas are derived from God's ideas, and the world itself is derived from God's ideas. So, it is a very Platonic view of this whole world, and the world was corruptible materialization of God's ideas, that that is why things were not perfect in the world. Even though God's ideas were perfect, the world is not perfect, and likewise our thoughts are true to the extent that they are accurate copies of God's ideas. That was the first starting point, Plato. Then we move on to Aristotle. Aristotle did away with the idea of a God, and he said that the world is out there and human ideas are human ideas, and they in some way correspond to the world essentially. So, our thoughts resemble the objects that they stand for. So, if I am thinking of an apple, then my thought of an apple resembles the apple in some sense. This is known as the correspondence theory of truth essentially, and one branch of philosophy which was taken up was by Ludwig Wittgenstein, who in his early works postulated something called the picture theory of language essentially, that behind every word there is a picture, an image which is sitting out there essentially. So, this is how the world as we saw it. The earth was flat at the center of the universe with the God's heavens rotating around it essentially. The sensible world, the world that we could sense, was composed of 5 elements: quintessence, which was constant in the heavens, did not change, constant in that sense, and 4 other elements which was fire, earth, water, fire, air, water and earth, listed in decreasing order of weight essentially. So, you can find similar ideas all over the world about what is the basic elements of the world essentially. So, if you ignore quintessence which is there in the heavens, you have fire, earth, water and air, and they are all jumbled up on earth, trying to find or striving to find their rightful place. Rightful place meaning by order of weight essentially. Earth should be the lowest, and then there should be water, and then air, and then fire. And different materials had different amounts of these 4 elements in them, and that is why they behave differently. So, for example, wood had more water and therefore and some air, and therefore it floated on water essentially, whereas iron had more earth and therefore it sank in water essentially. So, they could explain why wood floated whereas iron sank and so on, and if wood were to catch fire, then it would try to escape into air. So, they had these kind of explanations about the world essentially. And this is how the color inside these circles is supposed to represent the color of the sky. So, we have morning, daytime, evening and night, and as the sun, it depends upon the position of the sun, as the sun rotates, our day changes essentially. So, this is a small animation I created of what we thought about the world to be like. This is how the world was. All the heavens were rotating around and around the earth, and the earth was the center of the universe essentially. Now, in those days astronomy was for many reasons a very important science, and it was a very empirical science, but it was difficult to explain the motions of the planets. For those of you who are interested in astronomy, you would know that the stars are always in the same position. The constellations that we see, Leo or Virgo or any of these constellations, they always appear in the same fixed pattern throughout the year. It is only the planets which move from one constellation to another, and it was very difficult to explain how they were operating essentially. So, King Alfonso of Spain in 13th century got so upset that he said that if God had consulted me when creating the universe, he would have received good advice. Why have these planets move around in this erratic fashion essentially. This is a quotation I have got from McDermott's book. I should have mentioned it there. Then along came Copernicus essentially. Okay. So, this is the first, and this is what Hogeland says, the wedge between thought and reality. The first wedge between thought and reality was inserted by Copernicus, who says that what we see is not what really is. So, up till now, remember this picture theory, the notion of correspondence, that our thoughts are in the image of what we see around us, and that kind of a thing, that our thoughts reflect the world as it is. Copernicus was the first person who came, and you must be familiar with his book on revolutions of the celestial spheres. He said that that the earth is not at the center of the universe. In fact, the earth revolves around the sun, and earth rotates and creates the illusions of day and night, and that kind of a stuff essentially. The important thing from our point of view is that what we see is not what really is out there essentially. So, the wedge, as Hogeland says, between thought and reality. So, all these famous characters, you have encountered them in one way or the other. So, we know Galilei because of the equations of motion, for example, we always attribute them to Galileo, V is equal to u plus at, and that kind of stuff. But Galileo made this very important observation. He said that perception is an internal process. He says, and this is quoted to him, I think that tastes, odors, colors and so on and are no more than mere names as so far as the object in which we locate them are concerned. So, if you are smelling a rose and you feel that the rose smells nice, it is nothing to do. The notion of the smell of the rose is not located in the rose, but it is located in our minds. So, he says taste, odors, colors and so on are no more than mere names so far as the object in which we locate them are concerned, and that they reside in consciousness, in our minds, in other words. And he says that hence if the living creature were removed, that we as the perceivers of this taste and smell and odor were removed, all these qualities would be wiped away essentially. That this notion of taste and smell and color is something that we have in our heads, it is not a property of the object essentially. So, he goes on to explain, for example, he imagines that the notion of smell actually happens because there are these particles which are impinging upon the inside of our noses, which results in certain sensations which we call as smell essentially. It is very accurate, as you can see. But Galileo said this in the 17th century essentially, that perception is an internal process essentially. So, we are exploring this notion of thinking, how the notion of the mind evolves in the. So, all this is European history, because AI as we know it came out of European thought essentially. So, even though for example, other civilizations like Indian philosophy has a lot to say about such some of these concepts like knowledge and so on, but we are not, I mean AI did not come out of that essentially. Then Galileo says that philosophy is written in this grand book, the universe. It is written in the language of mathematics, and its characters are triangles, circles and other geometric figures. So, when Galileo was doing all this reasoning, algebra had not yet been invented essentially. In fact, his proofs of the equations that we attribute to him, like V is equal to u plus at, are essentially geometric in nature. So, if you look at Hogeland's book, you will see some idea of how he draws triangles and says that this side represents this side represents that, and the area represents this, and that kind of thing. All his reasoning was done for him. Mathematics was geometry, and he says that the whole world can be described in mathematics, the language of mathematics, and its characters are triangles, circles and other geometric figures essentially. So, you can see this another step away from the fact that our ideas are reflections of the real world out there. He is saying that you can think of motion, the laws of motion are about moving bodies using the language of mathematics. So, the very already the representation has moved to something which is different from the real world out there essentially. Next, we look at So, Galileo showed that geometry could be used to represent and reason about motion. This is what we just said. Then we come to the person who Hogeland calls as the grandfather of AI. It was the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, 1588-1679, who first put forward the view that thinking is a manipulation of symbols. This is fundamental to AI essentially, because after all we are talking about representing symbols and manipulating them and creating intelligence out of them essentially. So, Galileo had said that reality is mathematical in the sense that everything is made of particles, and our sense of smell or taste as how we reacted to those particles. Hobbes extended this notion to say that thought too was made up of or expressed in particles, which the thinker manipulated. Okay. So, Galileo is talking about external reality and how we can think about that or talk about that. Hobbes is talking about the internal process of thinking and saying that even thinking is basically the manipulation of something which he called as particles, which we now call symbols essentially. However, he had no answer to the question of how can a symbol mean anything, because we will see that for us intelligence is manipulating of symbols in a meaningful fashion, and Hobbes could never say how can a symbol mean anything. In fact, as Hogeland says, he could not distinguish, he could not tell us how minds are different from books, in the sense that books are also collections of symbols and minds are also collections of symbols which we are manipulating. How can the two be different? Because the idea of meaning is very elusive. So, if I were to ask you, how do you know the meaning of a word? How would you, what would your answer be? Just take any word, let us say. So, you could use examples or something like that. Okay. Talking about our standard source of meaning, which is a dictionary. So, if you want to look up a meaning of a word, you go and look up a dictionary. How does a dictionary give us meaning essentially? Because dictionary is only describing words in terms of other words essentially. When you give examples, also you are giving examples in terms of other words. Where does the meaning originate from? I mean, is there a fundamental source of meaning essentially? This is a kind of difficulty which Hobbes faces. Where does meaning come from essentially? we are also not able to say where meaning comes from. See, for the people before him, that the notion of an apple is because you see an apple and that is what it means essentially. Okay. But when we talk about language and thought and symbols, we have this difficulty of saying where does the meaning come from essentially. It is a question that we have not yet answered today essentially. This is a picture of Thomas Hobbes.